Welcome to Spotlight Chronicles, everyone. You know, when you think about like those really iconic couples, Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller are definitely right up there. And we're taking a deep dive today, going way beyond all the headlines and the gossip, trying to really get to the bottom of what drew them together and also what ultimately tore them apart.
Yeah, they were a fascinating couple. On the surface, they totally seemed like opposites. She was like Hollywood royalty, and he was this big-time playwright. But their story goes so much deeper than just like a clash of worlds.
Exactly. And we've got a ton of articles and notes that are going to help us uncover the truth about this whole romance. So let's rewind all the way back. It's 1950.
Yeah.
A young Marilyn Monroe. She's still on her way to stardom. And she meets Arthur Miller, who's already won a Pulitzer Prize.
It's funny, their first meeting wasn't love at first sight. Miller was actually married at the time. And even though he was obviously into Marilyn, he kind of played it cool.
But that whole aloof thing seems like it made her even more interested in him. She even said he was like a cool drink when you've had a fever. So different from all the guys she was used to in Hollywood. So do you think she was drawn to his intellect, his seriousness?
I think so, yeah. Monroe was often portrayed as this ditzy blonde, but she was smart. And she wanted more than just the superficial Hollywood scene. Miller, with all his depth and his rep as a serious writer, probably represented a world that she wanted to be a part of.
Makes sense. And even though Miller went back to New York, they started writing letters back and forth.
Yeah.
And these weren't just like your typical flirty Hollywood letters. They talked about books, ideas, even Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, those letters are amazing. They give you so much insight into their relationship early on. They show a real connection, a meeting of minds, not just physical attraction. Monroe even bought a biography of Lincoln because Miller recommended it, which says a lot about how much she wanted to connect with him on an intellectual level.
So for 4 years, they built this foundation through letters. Their connection was just simmering away while they were living these totally separate lives. It's wild how sometimes absence and anticipation can make attraction even stronger, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. That separation probably played a huge part in building the tension between them. The letters let them reveal themselves slowly without the pressure of being face to face. Plus, there's that whole thing about wanting what you can't have.
Right. And then fast forward to 1955, Monroe is a huge star now. And she moves to New York. She's determined to be closer to Miller. She even becomes friends with his close friends, the Rostons, so she can see him more. Talk about taking charge.
Oh, she was totally smitten, wasn't afraid to show it. And remember, this is the 1950s. Women were expected to be way more passive in relationships. But Monroe was a total trailblazer in a lot of ways. And her going after Miller shows just how independent she was.
Totally. And that's when their affair begins, setting the stage for this love story that would capture the whole world's attention. But their relationship played out under this intense scrutiny from the media and from people who just didn't think they were a good match.
Yeah, their romance was a total scandal waiting to happen.
Yeah.
The press followed their every move, and beyond the headlines, people were genuinely worried about whether their two different worlds could ever really come together. And don't forget, this is the Red Scare era. Miller's leftist views would soon put their relationship to the ultimate test. This is where it goes from Hollywood romance to something way more serious.
Yeah.
Like in 1956, Miller had to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Yeah.
HUAC.
Yeah, this was a really dark time in America. The Red Scare just shut down so much of Hollywood. So many careers got ruined because people were accused of being communist. The pressure on Miller must have been unbelievable.
Totally. He was facing a real chance of being blacklisted, which would have ended his career. And for Monroe, being with someone who is being investigated by HUAC could have been a disaster for her image.
You'd think her advisors would told her to just stay away from him, to protect her career. But she did the opposite. She stood by him totally publicly, which was so against the norm back then. It really showed how loyal she was.
It was a huge statement. It showed how deeply she felt about him. It must have meant the world to him to have the biggest star in Hollywood right there with him during such a crazy time. It made their bond even stronger and led to a huge life decision.
Because even with all that HUAC drama going on, Miller finalized his divorce. And they got married just a few days later, a civil ceremony on June 29th, 1956, then a Jewish ceremony on July 1st. So they were officially Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Miller. And the whole world was fascinated. It was such a whirlwind.
It really caught everyone's attention. The glamorous starlet and the brainy playwright together against all odds. It seemed like a true Hollywood fairy tale, at least from the outside. But fairy tales don't always show the whole picture.
And pretty soon things started to fall apart. They went to England for Monroe to film The Prince and the Showgirl with Laurence Olivier. But the filming was a mess. She fought with Olivier, her insecurities got worse, and then there was this awful discovery that changed everything.
Finding those private notes from Miller where he was saying he was disappointed in her, even embarrassed by her, that was a huge turning point. Imagine finding something like that from the man who wrote you all those love letters, the man you saw as this intellectual hero.
It's heartbreaking. Yeah. It totally shattered the perfect image she had of him. She felt betrayed and so insecure. The man she thought would give her stability and understanding was pulling away.
It's what happens when you idealize someone in a relationship. We put them on a pedestal project, all these fantasies onto them, and then we're crushed when they don't live up to those crazy expectations.
And for Miller, being married to the most famous woman in the world couldn't have been easy. All the media attention, the pressure, the chaos around her, it was so far from his quiet intellectual life.
Yeah, their different worlds, which seemed so interesting at first, were starting to cause problems. Their needs and what they wanted weren't matching up anymore, and it was putting a lot of strain on their marriage.
And on top of all that, Monroe really wanted to be a mother. She had a couple of miscarriages, which were incredibly painful, and she blamed herself. It made her problems with substance abuse even worse.
It's important to remember the pressure on women back then to have kids. Motherhood was seen as the ultimate goal. And for someone like Monroe, who wanted love and stability, those miscarriages must have been devastating.
Absolutely. And then, as if all that wasn't enough, problems started popping up in their careers. Monroe felt Miller was selling out by rewriting the script for her movie, Let's Make Love. And to make things even worse, she saw how he didn't seem to care about her affair with her co-star, Yves Montand. It made her feel even more unloved and unwanted.
It's like their roles flipped. Miller, who was drawn to her vulnerability at first, now seemed distant and critical. And Monroe, who wanted his strength and guidance, felt alone and resentful.
The bond they built through those letters and during the HUAC hearings, it was unraveling. And the project that was supposed to bring them closer, Miller's screenplay for The Misfits, ended up reflecting how their marriage was falling apart.
The Misfits, that title, turned out to be so fitting. The whole production was full of problems, just like their relationship. Monroe hated the script, had trouble with rewrites, and her substance abuse got really bad. She ended up in the hospital.
It's like their real lives, and the movie became one big mess. That feeling of being lost and out of sync,
Yeah.
it was everywhere.
It makes you wonder if those last scenes in the movie with Monroe and Clark Gable standing in that huge, empty landscape, weren't they also showing the emotional state of their marriage?
It's a sad thought. This couple who were so in love. Now they seemed lost, each of them in their own world of pain and disappointment. And even though they tried to fix things, the damage was done. By November 1960, they announced they were getting divorced. The end of one of Hollywood's most captivating love stories.
And just like their romance, their divorce played out in public. Monroe chose a date that was the same as John F. Kennedy's inauguration. She was hoping to avoid the media, a quiet ending to a very public affair.
It's tough to think about how something that started with so much promise and passion ended in so much heartbreak. But their story, even the ending, tells us a lot about how complicated relationships can be, especially when you throw in fame, personal struggles, and societal pressure. Even though their divorce was like final in 1961, the story doesn't really end there. You know, Monroe said that famous line, he should love the monster too, like, but maybe I'm too demanding. What do you think she meant by that?
It's interesting. It kind of shows you how their relationship worked. On the one hand, she knew she had her issues, right? The monster could be her insecurities, her addiction. But it also sounds like she felt like she wasn't fully accepted, loved for who she really was.
Like she wanted someone to love every part of her,
Yeah.
even the bad parts. And then it's so sad. Just a year and a half after the divorce, Monroe died. It's like their names are forever linked because of that.
It's hard to imagine what Miller was going through after she died, all the grief, the mixed emotions. He didn't go to her funeral. He just said, she won't be there.
Yeah.
People saw that as callous or like this really personal way of dealing with his loss.
And then things got even more complicated. A few years later, he put on his play After the Fall, and everyone thought the character Maggie, this troubled singer, was supposed to be Monroe.
Oh, yeah, that play caused a lot of controversy. People said Miller was using his relationship with Monroe to make art. And it was pretty obvious, like Maggie's vulnerability, her addiction problems, the crazy relationship with her husband. It was all very similar to Monroe's life.
And when Miller said that Maggie wasn't based on Monroe, people didn't believe him. It brought up this question about whether artists can use their personal lives in their work, especially when the person they're writing about is gone and can't defend themselves.
Yeah, where's the line between art and real life? Can you ever really separate them? And Miller made it even more confusing. when he wrote about his relationship with Monroe and other stuff, like his play in 2004, Finishing the Picture, which was about making the misfits.
It's like he was still trying to understand their past,
Yeah.
using his art to figure it out.
Their story, even after all those years, still had a hold on him. Maybe even though they split up and it was painful, a part of him never really moved
It
on.
was like two worlds colliding, their relationship. You had love, ambition, loyalty, heartbreak, and their story with all the ups and downs. It still fascinates us. It makes us think about the mysteries of love and how fame can be so alluring but also have a dark side. They were these huge icons who wanted something amazing, a love that went beyond their different worlds. And even though it ended sadly, it reminds us that even the most passionate love stories can be messy and complicated. At the end of the day, they're human stories.
And when we look back at it all, it makes you wonder, were they doomed from the beginning? Or were they just two people who were totally different but had this intense connection that would link them forever in Hollywood history?
It's a question that keeps us interested, keeps the debate going. Just like Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller still capture our imaginations. So thanks for joining us for the Spotlight Chronicles deep dive into their fascinating and ultimately tragic love story. We hope you learned something new and have something to think about. Until next time, keep exploring those stories that matter.